King Arthur, the history and folklore of the Arthurian legend. Written by Charles River Editors, Jesse Harasta, and narrated by Sabrina Z. Introduction. King Arthur is one of the most famous names in history, and his name still evokes visions of fantasy, chivalry, bravery, and more, even today. Arthur remains a pop culture fixture around the globe, made famous in various Arthurian tales written by writers like Chretien de Troyes. Arthur came to embody the ideals of the Middle Ages: strength, chivalry, bravery, and more. Along the way, his Excalibur sword, the Holy Grail, his queen, and more have all become household words. Arthur has long been identified as a folk hero, and there are countless tales that comprise the Arthurian legend. But was there an actual person that the original stories were based on? People still search for the seeds of truth in the Knights of the Round Table and the historical figure that inspired the Arthurian tales. Of course, as with all great myths, even those with a kernel of truth behind them, there is no real Arthur. Arthur is now comprised of the works written by diverse storytellers, most of which have been built upon the ancient stories and possible history. It is from there that a primordial seed of myth remains at the heart of all the retellings. At the same time, Arthur's story is one of transformation, as he is brought from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance and more modern times. And that story also includes the famous contemporaries in his stories and other important historical figures like Geoffrey of Monmouth, the imprisoned Sir Thomas Mallory, and Walt Disney. When looking for the historical and mythical Arthur, scholars try to understand how the Arthur of these tales and of others, like Disney's Sword in the Stone and Monty Python and the Holy Grail, came to be. What are the origins of the Arthur legend, and what can they tell people about the past? What is the historical basis for King Arthur, if any? Chapter 1. Searching for Arthur. There drew he forth the brand Excalibur, and o'er him drawing it, the winter moon, brightening the skirts of a long cloud, ran forth and sparkled keen with frost against the hilt. For all the heft twinkled with diamond sparks, myriads of topaz lights, and jacinth work of subtlest jewelry. Lord Tennyson. On the high sea cliffs of Cornwall's north coast, there is a place steeped in legend, weathered by centuries, and, as is so often the case in such places, encrusted in tourist knickknacks. The ruins of Tintagel Castle, the legendary place of the conception of King Arthur. Visitors arrive in the village of Tintagel, until recently named Trevanna, and perhaps park in the Middle Ages parking lot, walking by Merlin's slot machines and numerous shops with wizard-shaped candles and glass dragons. This is the Arthuriana of today. It is both amusing and tacky, but Tintagel Castle and the legends born there have far deeper layers beyond the plastic swords and Disney knockoffs. Entering the historic site brings people to the next level of Arthur's story. Looking at the interpretive signs, visitors quickly realize that they are hardly the first to look back on Arthur and his knights. This castle was rebuilt once before, during the Tudor age of King Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I, in a far grander style than its original form. It is predominantly these 15th century walls that tumble dramatically down the cliffs and sit amongst tough heather plants, backed by the dramatic slate gray sea. This grandiose construction served one purpose: to demonstrate that the Tudor kings positioned themselves as the foretold return of Arthur, whom they imagined to be the paragon of their elaborate code of chivalry and the first great king of their lands. At the same time, there is a deeper history to Arthur, and a more ancient intangible yet. This Arthur was a mighty warrior, maybe a mythical being, who perhaps led the Celtic people of Britain's Dark Age in a glorious and ultimately unsuccessful defense of the island from Germanic invaders. That castle remains here too, a simple post-Roman fort guarding a harbor leading to rich sea routes. Its crumbled walls served as the foundations for the Tudors' construction. There are two ways of exploring the origins of Arthur. The first is to scour the historical and archaeological record for potential candidates who might have been the real Arthur. These historical figures emerged after the collapse of the Roman Empire and might have served as the original template. Historians may then attempt to track how various peoples throughout history have built upon, elaborated, or simplified the story. Given all the time that has passed, a second method involves ignoring the question of whether there was a real Arthur, and instead treats the entire matter of Britain as a mythological cycle. This is done simply by analyzing the literature itself. What does the Arthurian cycle tell people about humanity? How is it connected to other myths? And is there a connection to a shared human monomyth? Although they sound completely different, these two approaches are not actually mutually exclusive. It is entirely possible, and maybe even probable, that there was a historical figure or figures who inspired the Arthurian legend. At the same time, Arthur's durability across time is certainly due more to his mythological components, his relationship to ancient stories, and to the universal human story. By tracing both the historical and mythological origins of Arthur, it's possible to see where they differ and where they converge, which forms a more comprehensive and complex body of stories that comprises King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Chapter 2. Historic Origins. In 1991, historian Thomas Charles Edwards wrote, "At this stage of the enquiry, one can only say that there may well have been an historical Arthur. The historian can, as yet, say nothing of value about him. Indeed, when searching for the historical figure who Arthur is based upon, a decent place to start is with the acknowledgement that such a person may never have actually existed." It was quite common for writers in the Middle Ages to conflate fictional and historical figures. For example, in Dante's Inferno, historical and legendary figures mingled together frequently. In England, medieval chroniclers turned the twin Saxon horse gods of Hengist and Horsa into historic warlords who they claimed led the Saxon invasion of Britain, and those figures also bear striking similarities to other mythological figures concocted by other European peoples. That said, while it is possible that Arthur has no historic origins, it is also very possible that he does. Naturally, many scholars of both the professional and armchair varieties have speculated over who these figures might be, and there is still heavy debate on the topic. The most prominent figure among these theories is Ambrosius Aurelianus, also known as Emrys Wledig in Welsh. The chronicler Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote that Ambrosius was the second son of Emperor Constantine, and that as a child he was sent to live in Brittany to escape King Vortigern of Britain. As a young man, Ambrosius returned to a Britain in chaos amidst the collapse of Vortigern's control and the hordes of invading Saxons. He battled Vortigern and is said to have won control over the western regions of Britain, including those that are still the most Celtic today. Vortigern called increasingly upon Saxon allies as the two battled for control, and eventually Vortigern fled, leaving Ambrosius as king of the Britons. After the death of Vortigern, Ambrosius pushed the Saxons back to the north of Britain, where they remained for the rest of his life. Ambrosius's role as a defender of the Britons was recorded by his contemporary, Saint Gildas, in De Excidio e Conquestu Britanniae, on the ruin and conquest of Britain. This is important because Gildas does not mention Arthur. This fact can be interpreted in various ways. It can be taken as evidence for the Ambrosius connection, for the non-existence of a historical Arthur, or simply as an oversight, since he does not mention Vortigern either. Historians are almost certain that Vortigern existed. Describing Ambrosius, St. Gildas wrote around 540 A.D. that they might not be utterly destroyed. The remnants of the British take up arms and challenge their victors to battle under Ambrosius Aurelianus. He was a man of unassuming character, who alone of the Roman race chanced to survive the storm in which his parents, people undoubtedly clad in purple, had been killed. Their offspring, in our days, have greatly degenerated from their ancestral nobleness. From that time, the citizens were sometimes victorious, sometimes the enemy, up to the year of the siege of Mont Badonicus. Another important and well-respected historian of the Dark Ages was Bede the Venerable, who also mentions Ambrosius but not Arthur. He wrote his Ecclesiastical History in 731 and describes Ambrosius in this way. They had at that time for their leader Ambrosius Aurelianus, a man of worth, who alone, by chance of the Roman nation, had survived the storm in which his parents, who were of royal race, had perished. Under him the Britons revived, and offering battle to the victors by the help of God, gained the victory. From that day, sometimes the natives, and sometimes their enemies, prevailed, till the year of the siege of Badon Hill, when they made no small slaughter of those enemies, about 44 years after their arrival in England. Based on these sources, Ambrosius is well placed to serve as the origin of Arthur. He is a nobleman who disappears and returns to take up his appointed role as the defender of Britons. And during his reign, the Saxons are held back. The Britons rally behind him, and he is known for his moderation and wisdom. Moreover, his name, Aurelianus, while not exactly Arthur, is similar enough to the legendary king that it's easier to imagine the evolution of his name into Arthur than it would be with a name like Vortigern. With that said, there's a major problem in this theory. The primary recorder of the life of Ambrosius, Geoffrey of Monmouth, also records the life of Arthur in great detail, and is quite clear in his writings that they are two different people. Geoffrey of Monmouth specifically states that Ambrosius's father and Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, were both sons of King Constantine, a descendant of the Roman overlords. He also wrote that Arthur was born after Ambrosius's death. Since Geoffrey is one of the most important chroniclers of Arthur's life, at least of those that survived the Middle Ages, his writings must carry some weight. Another potential candidate is Reothamus, a name or possibly a title meaning Great King. He is listed on the roll of kings of Britain. Reothamus appears to have been a real person, or at least the Roman diplomat who wrote to him in 460 AD thought he was. Riothamus appears to have been the king of the Celtic peoples of Brittany as well as Britain, and he was called across the Channel twice to lead military campaigns in Gaul. Most notably, this is the same time that Geoffrey of Monmouth would later say Arthur was fighting in Gaul. It is this overseas emphasis in Riothamus's biography, combined with Geoffrey's similar emphasis, lost in most later retellings, that supports the theory that Riothamus is the historical Arthur. Riothamus has recently had a strong proponent in a scholar named Geoffrey Ashe, who championed that connection in his book, The Discovery of King Arthur, 1985. But his evidence has not silenced the debates on this issue. An interesting alternative proposal was that the name Arthur did not signify a person, but a title, and that it meant the Bear King. The word art means bear in many Celtic languages, including both Welsh and Cornish, and this theory is reinforced by two pieces of early evidence. The Y Gudwyn, an 11th century Welsh poem, refers to a warrior who glutted black ravens, that is, killed many men, on the rampart of the stronghold, although he was no Arthur, a reference which could admittedly mean a name as well. Then there is also the Arthurian stone, found in Tintagel, which could translate to famous bear. The written record of the Dark Ages, which is spotty at best, will never fully answer the questions about the nature of Arthur's origins and whether he was based on a real man, but there are other sources of evidence that scholars can rely on. While archaeology can tell historians much about the broad sweep of history, its ability to pinpoint the locations and events of specific individuals, especially in the deep past, is limited. Arthurian archaeology has focused upon the excavation of sites which have been passed down as being linked to Arthurian tales in the oral record. The first and most recognizable site is the ruins of Tintagel Castle on the Cornish coast, where Arthur is said to have been conceived and born. Excavations performed at this site in the 1980s and 90s have shown that there was a Dark Age fort at the site during the appropriate period, and that it was particularly wealthy for the region, which indicates that it was possibly the home of a local king or chieftain. This leaves open the possibility that the written reports that survived the Middle Ages are accurate, though it does not confirm anything. A wrinkle emerged in 1998 when caretakers of Tintagel, a government body called English Heritage, announced that they had found a piece of slate which read, "Arthurian, father of a descendant of Cole, has made this." Further analysis led some to believe that the author was claiming descent from Cole Hen, the famous Old King Cole of York, also one of Arthur's claimed ancestors. This claim that this was proof for the Arthurian connection led to a storm of controversy, which has not yet fully died down. This evidence is still fairly slim, but it increases the possibility that Tintagel is actually connected to the historic king. Another well-known piece of evidence for the reality of Arthur emerged in 1191 when the monks of Glastonbury Abbey claimed to have found a tomb containing a man and a blonde-haired woman. The tomb was inscribed, "Here lies entombed King Arthur with Guinevere, his second wife, on the Isle of Avalon." This was a blessing for the monastery, which had recently suffered a devastating fire, because the remains served to restore it to a position of prominence and gave it a lucrative source of pilgrim revenue. It also served as a useful piece of political propaganda during a period of Welsh-English struggle. As one writer noted, The alleged discovery of Arthur's tomb then was propaganda that the English could use against the Welsh, proving to them definitively that their savior was permanently deceased and would never return to liberate them. Due to these reasons, as well as a lack of any evidence, both bodies and inscription disappeared. Modern scholars strongly doubt the veracity of the Glastonbury find. However, the area around Glastonbury remains a place rich in Arthurian connections, especially due to the belief that the Holy Grail, a key part of the Arthurian cycle, is located there. Another important archaeological site is the most likely purported location of Arthur's court at Camelot, the Cadbury Hill Fort. Like Tintagel, Cadbury has an association with Arthur in oral history, which actually appears to predate the invention of Camelot by Romantic literature in the 12th century. Archaeology at the site in the 1970s revealed the existence of a Dark Age hill fort. This was not a castle, as people imagine them today, as such structures did not exist at the time of Arthur, but it was still an impressive fortification. Like Tintagel, the impressive fort indicates the presence of a prominent leader, if not a king. In fact, this is one of the most elaborate strongholds of the period ever found, giving credence to the claims that the great warlord Arthur lived there. Again, this does not mean that the powerful leader had to be Arthur, as there were other major figures of the period that could have financed and needed such a structure. Ambrosius Aurelianus and his enemy Vortigern both fit the bill, as does Riothamus and Arthur's legendary father, Uther Pendragon. Chapter 3. Merlin, a single plausible candidate? The character of Merlin, the magical but human counselor of Arthur, is probably as old as Arthur himself. The prophecies of Merlin appear in early Celtic documents, and Merlin has come to be seen in recent years as a representative of the old pre-Christian faith of Britain, perhaps even as the last of the Druids, even though there is no hint of this in the earliest writings except for his use of magic and his gift of prophecy. Merlin's name appears to have been an alteration of the name Merddin Wyllt, who was a legendary madman and a prophet living in Dark Ages Scotland. A few texts survive within the National Library of Wales. Describing the seer living in the wild Caledonian forests of Scotland and providing cryptic prophecy. It is probable that Geoffrey of Monmouth took this character, altered the name, and put his own words into his mouth, which was not an uncommon literary occurrence in those days. Moreover, Geoffrey of Monmouth set Merlin as a historical figure in the times of Ambrosius and Vortigern, who came decades before Merddin Wyllt lived, and he intersperses Merlin's prophecies with a mixture of both pagan and Christian elements. Geoffrey's publication of Merlin's supposed prophecies in the Prophetiae Merlini was taken very seriously until about the 17th century, when people of that era began to consider the prophecies false. Nevertheless, oral legends about Merlin's ties to Arthur, magic, druids, and Christianity were all passed down to create the figure as readers envision him today. Chapter 4. The Origins of Arthurian Folklore. As scholars began to study human myths and legends across cultures in the late 19th century, they began to discover some surprising cross-cultural similarities. These shared traits spawned an entire discipline of academia, including works by venerable scholars like James Frazer and Levi Strauss. One of the more fruitful avenues of examination was developed by an American scholar named Joseph Campbell, who would later become famous as a creative consultant for the Star Wars films. Looking across a wide variety of stories from around the world, Campbell postulated that they were all expressions of a single monomyth, mono meaning one, which was an expression of something fundamental in human experience. Campbell argued that at the heart of all of these disparate stories was the tale of the hero, and he named his seminal work Hero with a Thousand Faces. The hero was a representation of the human being and his, or sometimes her, journeys to reflect numerous aspects of life, including maturation from childhood to adulthood, the inner journey for enlightenment, and society's quest for harmony and perfection. All of these elements were symbolized by the hero's quest, which Campbell argued had several parts. The quest begins with a call, when the hero is separated out from the rest of society and marked as special. Then the hero may gather wisdom from elderly advisors, pick up helpful tools, or even reject the call and be forced back on the right track. He then leaves the known world, entering another world of magic, power, danger, and opportunity. There, the hero engages in a number of tests, which are challenges, physical, mental, or spiritual. Finally, the hero faces an ultimate challenge, like battling his or her own shadow twin, overcoming an ultimate temptation, or the need to die and be reborn. Finally, the hero leaves the unknown world and returns home with a boon, a tool for restoring the world. The analysis of this myth involves simultaneously examining many layers of story together, because the Arthurian cycle is not a single document in the way that a novel or a film is. The Arthurian cycle is a collection of stories, songs, ceremonies, and other texts that appear and disappear at different times in history. Perhaps not surprisingly, some contradict each other outright, and others vary widely in style and message. These individual artistic pieces can be analyzed as myths on their own, but they also create a picture that can be taken as a whole. The overarching myth in the Arthur cycle is the story of the king himself. His birth is foretold famously by a young Merlin, who observes a battle between a red and a white dragon that represents the Celts and the Saxons, respectively. In some stories, he is then hidden away in the home of a knight named Sir Ector until the call is made explicitly and he withdraws the sword in the stone. He then becomes the King of Britain, bringing an era of peace, justice, and respite from Saxon invasion through his court at Camelot, until he is brought down by his own son Mordred, whom he sired due to the magical trickery of his half-sister, Morgause. The High King does not die, but instead is taken away to the Isle of Avalon to await being reborn when his people need him most. All of the elements of the hero's journey are present: the call, the separation, gifts from the wise, and powerful helpers like Merlin and the Lady of the Lake, challenges and battle with his dark twin, his illegitimate nephew/son. His boon of good kingship is taken from the world until his return. Of course, these are not the only tales woven into the Arthurian cycle. While there are numerous small stories, the two other major arcs are the betrayal of Queen Guinevere with Sir Lancelot, and the search for the Holy Grail, primarily by Sir Gawain and Sir Galahad. The tale of the Holy Grail is most explicitly a hero's journey, where the pure Galahad, enabled by the earlier boon of Arthur's court, is able to bring back the Holy Grail and restore Christ's love on earth. Sir Thomas Mallory cast Galahad as the ideal hero, whose virtues are entirely due to his piety and chastity. And that theme was perpetuated by poets like Lord Tennyson, whose own Galahad states, "My good blade carves the casques of men. My tough lance thrusteth sure. My strength is as the strength of 10, because my heart is pure. I never felt the kiss of love, nor maiden's hand in mine." The Guinevere, Lancelot, Arthur tale is one of love, betrayal, and suffering. And it is similar to another legend about Tristan and Isolde. Like in the story of the birth of Mordred, here Arthur is brought down not by a force of arms, but by betrayal, subterfuge, and incest. The Guinevere Lancelot story is not literal incest and is thus not as destructive as the Mordred story. But it comes close, since both figures have deep bonds to Arthur. Guinevere is his wife, and Lancelot is his brother in arms, and was raised by Arthur's benefactor, the Lady of the Lake. It is the deep nature of the betrayal that gives the story much of its mythological power. One anthropologist of myth, Claude Levi-Strauss, examined the taboo against incest, noting its universality in human societies, and explaining how its appearance in myth serves to represent an inversion of the social order and typically presages the destruction of that same order. Furthermore, it can be argued that Arthur emerges as a cultural hero, a mythical or mythicized historical figure who embodies the aspirations or ideals of a society. The earliest Arthur stories have him not as a king or enemy of the Saxons, but as a wandering hero who embodies the best of what the Britons saw in men: bravery, generosity, loyalty to family, and physically vibrant. Finn McCool, or Fionn McCool, fulfills a similar role amongst the Gaelic people of Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man, where Arthur is a great mythical king, endowed with great powers, but still mortal. Of the Britons, especially the Welsh and Cornish, Finn holds the same position amongst the Western neighbors. In fact, the biggest difference between Fionn and Arthur is that the stories about Fionn simply didn't circulate as far or as much during the Middle Ages, ensuring that his story was less well known. And since less was written about Finn over the centuries, the legend didn't continue to build upon previous works, thus making Finn's story less modern at the same time. While Arthur may or may not have been based on historical figures, there are several characters that most certainly have mythological roots, particularly Morgan Le Fay and the Lady of the Lake. Much speculation has been made about Morgan Le Fay. The title Le Fay literally means the fairy, but in a time long before Tinker Bell transformed popular images of them, fairies were powerful, mysterious, and otherworldly beings. What is agreed about Morgan is that she is a woman with magical powers who is deeply involved, though typically at a distance, with Arthur's reign. She sometimes aims to undermine him, and sometimes seems more benign. The scholarly argument revolves around whether she was a creation of the Arthurian storytellers or whether she descends from a pre-Christian Celtic goddess. In Irish myth, the pre-Christian gods became known as the Fae after they were driven underground by the humans. The most common argument is that she is the Welsh goddess Modron, but with her Breton name, Morgan. Less plausible, but still possible, is that she is a reference to the Irish war goddess Morrigan. Like Morgan Le Fay, the Lady in the Lake, who has many names, is most likely derived from ancient legends. The lady's home in a kingdom under the waters of a magical lake, her gifts to the heroes Arthur and Lancelot, and her eventual presence on the boat that takes Arthur back to Avalon, hence her apparent immortality, all speak to her as more of a water spirit or water goddess than a woman. This has led some scholars to argue that she is a remnant of an earlier Celtic lake goddess. Some have gone a step further and maintained that Morgan and the lady are in fact aspects of the same goddess, divided into two characters, one virtuous and one villainous, by later writers, but this argument is largely speculative. Chapter 5. Early Literature. While legend says that Arthur was born at Tintagel Keep, a more accurate statement might be that Arthur and the Arthurian legend were born out of the imaginations, the fears, and the dreams of the Celtic-speaking peoples of western and southwestern Britain, those who are today called the Welsh and the Cornish. Scholars refer to the earliest stage of Arthur literature as pre-Galfridian, with Galfridius being the Latin name for Geoffrey. In other words, pre-Galfridian literature consists of the writings that existed before Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote the history of the kings of Britain. Today's scholars have 5 full manuscripts and 20 shorter texts which refer to Arthur, though many of these mention him only somewhat in passing. It's safe to assume that there were far more works that did not survive, and there were countless oral tales that were probably never recorded. Thus, most scholars assume these 25 works are the tip of an unknowable iceberg. The earliest tale about Arthur is the Welsh tale, Gulhwch and Olwen, believed to have been written in the early 12th century. In this tale, Arthur is as a defender of the people, a defender of his country against every kind of danger, both internal and external, a slayer of giants and witches, a hunter of monstrous animals, giant boars, a savage cat monster, a winged serpent, or dragon. He is also a freer of prisoners, an important role for the Welsh peasants who feared slavers, whether they were Saxon, Norse, or others. It was not until rather late in this role as a freer of prisoners that Arthur begins to become a war hero and a leader of the defense of Celtic Britain against the Saxons. Arthur's companions at this point include Kai and Bedwyr, who would become Sir Kay and Sir Bedivere, respectively. They are heroes and strong men who travel the countryside fighting magical monstrosities. Kai is the chief of these followers, and unlike the boastful Sir Kay, who is used for comic relief by the troubadours, Kai is a hero second only to Arthur himself. Bedwyr, Arthur's other close companion, wielded a magical spear and was famous for a battle with a wolf man. Along with Kai and Bedwyr, Arthur is also often accompanied by Gwalchmai, son of Gwyr. Gwalchmai is the son of Arthur's sister, and this character might be the prototype for Gawain, though this is not as easy to trace as the connections between Kai Kay and Bedwyr Bedivere. The next major character is Medrot, the early Mordred. The nature of this character is a bit obscure, as no source uninfluenced by Geoffrey of Monmouth or the Brutes makes Medrot Arthur's nephew or his betrayer/opponent. In fact, they seem rather to contradict these claims, making him a hero or a companion of Arthur. Unlike Gwalchmai, who is specifically named as a kinsman of Arthur, no such connections are made for Medrot. Uther Pendragon, who becomes Arthur's father Uther in later writings, also appears in the earliest writings. It is probable that he was thought of as Arthur's father, or something of a magical Merlin-like figure who changes form and advises the hero. Finally, this early tale included Gwenhwyvar, better known today as Guinevere, Arthur's wife. One of the prominent stories involving her has to do with her kidnapping by a villain named Mallory. After Arthur becomes a leader, his military campaigns, including a siege of Glastonbury, help win her back. The tale of Gulhwch and Olwen was preserved in a Welsh language collection called the Mabinogion, which was only translated into English by Lady Charlotte Guest in the 19th century. In the Mabinogion, Arthur is an overlord and a famed slayer of monsters. Arthur's cousin, Gulhwch, requests his aid in winning the marriage of a beautiful giant named Olwen, who he is infatuated with due to a curse from his spiteful stepmother. Arthur sends his warriors, including Kai, Bedwyr, and Gwalchmai, and Olwen's father requests the completion of 40 impossible tasks, though the tale only recounts a few of them. This tale, however, largely serves as a frame for a long exposition of the heroic events in the life of Arthur and the lists of important persons. The most well-known event, which was recounted in other places as well, was Arthur's hunt of the great boar, Turth Truith. The direct links to oral traditions can be seen in this story. The recounting of long lists of ancestry was an important part of the bardic oral tradition, and the tale of Turth Truith has direct links to other famous boars of Celtic lore. The Great Boar in the Mabinogion is similar to the Torc Triath in Ireland, and the Great Cornish Sow, Henwen, which gave birth to monsters fought by pre-Galfridian heroes. In fact, some legends claim Henwen gave birth to the cat monster Cath Palug, which was killed by either Kai or Arthur, depending on the version. In these early stories, the picture of Arthur, established by earlier sources, is of a leader of a roving band of warriors. This band includes Kai, Bedwyr, Gwalchmai, Medrot, and occasionally Uther, and the band wins glory, fights for treasure, such as a magical cauldron from Ireland, travels to the underworld, kills monsters, frees prisoners, and protects the people of the land. In this form, they closely resemble other cultural heroes, including the Irishman Fan MacCool and his band of warriors, the Finians. Arthur and his band are also depicted like the Irishman Cuchulainn and even the Greeks Theseus. Over time, however, this role of being the protector of the people would evolve from killing monsters to fighting Saxons, the primary enemy of the Welsh and Cornish, in the years after the fall of the Roman Empire. This transformation is easy to understand, regardless of whether Arthur was based on a historical figure or not. For example, it could be that there was a historical figure, like Ambrosius, to whom subsequent legends were attached. Or it could be that there was simply an evolution in the mythological character of Arthur to suit new needs in cultural storytelling. Perhaps the most important event attributed to this new Arthur was the victory at the Battle of Badon. Interestingly, the first reference to Badon is by the chronicler Saint Gildas, who does not mention Arthur, but describes Ambrosius Aurelianus as the leader. He sets its date at 496 AD and describes how the victory in this battle halted the advance of the Saxons for a generation, guaranteeing the peace and survival of the Celtic peoples. Gildas is particularly important because he is the only person who wrote of the battle as having occurred in his lifetime. 496 was the year of his birth, but the event certainly would have been within the memory of his parents' generation and make him the closest contemporary to them. The battle is also mentioned by the Venerable Bede in his ecclesiastical history of the English people, 731 AD, and he credits the victory to Ambrosius. About 65 years later, the Welsh monk, Nennius, describes the battle and attributes it to Arthur in his Historia Brittonium, circa 796 AD. Nennius also gives long descriptions of Arthur's campaigns against the Saxons. Furthermore, another similar source is the Annales Cambriae, which is dated to around 796 AD and written in the same manuscript as Nennius's work. Annales Cambriae elaborates on Arthur's role, and after these were published near the end of the 8th century, Ambrosius is no longer credited with the battle, and it is always attributed to Arthur. It should also be noted that the battle is never mentioned in Saxon sources, such as Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, but this might be simply because it did not have the same importance when viewed from their eyes. There was another battle during this period that would become central to the Arthurian legend, the Battle of Camlan. In this battle, Arthur and Mordred face off, leaving Mordred dead and Arthur gravely wounded. The Annales Cambriae mentions this battle as having occurred in 537 and mentions that both men died, but not that they fought against each other. What happened between the early 500s when Gildas wrote and the late 700s when Nennius wrote? It is possible that Nennius created the Arthur at Badon story, but its widespread acceptance after the Annales Cambriae and Nennius's work indicates Arthur had been given credit for being at the battle in oral legends before those writings. By the 9th century, Arthur had most likely emerged from his position as a leader of a band of wandering heroes to become the military defender of the Welsh and Cornish. It was probable that he was already the once and future king at this point, and that he had taken primacy in the legends of his people. This was probably a slow, multi-generational process, as stories about him were told and retold as they were passed down to subsequent generations. The Arthurian legend has always been plastic enough to absorb outside stories, from King Lear and Ambrosius Aurelianus to Joseph of Arimathea. One of the more prominent stories to join the Arthurian legend has been that of Tristan and Isolde. The story is a straightforward romance. Tristan serves King Mark of Cornwall lovingly, bravely, and loyally. But when Mark sends Tristan to pick up his new Irish bride, Isolde, the two accidentally drink a love potion intended for Mark and Isolde. Their love tears apart the court and finally destroys them. By the late Middle Ages, this story is worked into the Arthurian legend via Le Mot d'Arthur, but it appears to have originally been a standalone tale itself. It certainly presages the Arthur-Guinevere-Lancelot tragedy, but the story of Tristan and Isolde contains more magic than that story, since Lancelot and Guinevere made conscious decisions, while Tristan and Isolde were controlled by outside forces. The fusion of Tristan's story and the Arthurian legend is important because it demonstrates the conversion of the Arthur story from a tale of Celtic resistance to one of courtly romance and chivalry. The story's references to Cornwall and Tristan's legendary home of Lyonesse, an island kingdom that sunk under the sea off the coast of Cornwall, have made it popular in Cornish circles, and it was the first major work to be translated into modern Cornish. It has also been the target of French scholarship, ever since folklorist Joseph Bédier argued that all of Tristan's tales could be traced back to a single Tristan, which he attempted to reconstruct in 1900. After the Norman invasion of Britain, the arrival of the tradition of French romances brought one of the most important elements of modern Arthurian legend into the fold: the quest for the Holy Grail, the cup Jesus drank from during the Last Supper, and which caught his blood during the crucifixion. For several centuries, there has been a folk belief in Britain that during Jesus Christ's unknown years, the time after his childhood and before his ministry, which the Bible is silent on, Jesus accompanied his uncle, Joseph of Arimathea, on a trade journey to Britain. A further extension of this story is that after Christ's death, Joseph of Arimathea took the Holy Grail to Britain and brought Christianity along with him. He supposedly settled in Glastonbury and established the monastery there, and then his descendants became monarchs of Britain, including Arthur. Some modern scholars argue that this story depicts a Christianization of early Celtic gods thought of as royal ancestors. The legend was that Joseph hid the Grail in the Chalice Well in Glastonbury, and from that hill 2 springs emerged, one with red water representing the blood of Christ, and one of white water representing the sweat of Christ. Joseph is also said to have brought a staff grown from the crown of thorns and planted it in Glastonbury, which has its own Arthurian associations as the possible site of Avalon. This thorn tree was said to flower at Christmas and Easter, which was not typical of normal hawthorns, and there has long been a tradition of sending its flowers to the royal Christmas table. The original tree was cut down by Oliver Cromwell's troops in the English Civil War, but today its branches live and are grafted onto other trees. This legend dates back to at least the 12th century, where it can be found in a poem entitled Joseph d'Armité by Robert de Baron, but it became particularly popular in Britain during the 19th century. Even then, it was associated with the Arthurian legend, as de Baron claimed that Percival was a descendant of Joseph. It was crystallized in a poem, And Did Those Feet in Ancient Time, by William Blake, 1808, which was eventually turned into a song titled Jerusalem. In it, Blake asks, And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the Holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? Blake's song became famous throughout Britain and is the anthem of the Women's Institute, thanks to its fusion of English exceptionalism, Christian nationalism, and romantic anti-industrialism. It condemns the dark satanic mills. Chapter 6. Arthur's Chroniclers. Geoffrey of Monmouth is the single most important chronicler of the story of Arthur in history. Geoffrey brought Arthur to the world outside of Welsh and Cornish-speaking communities and laid the groundwork for every subsequent tale. It could be said that he was the literal kingmaker, as it is in Geoffrey's writings that Arthur is first referred to as a king. Who was this man, and what were all his additions to the Arthurian canon? Geoffrey, who had no last name, like most people in his era, was a priest who lived roughly 1100 to 1155, and is best known for his work Historia Regnum Britanniae, History of the Kings of Britain. Geoffrey was born somewhere in Wales or the Welsh borderlands, and while his birthday is unknown, he was recorded as an official witness and hence was an adult in 1129. He refers to himself as of Monmouth, so he was either born there or had some strong relationship to the town. There is no good evidence to suggest that Geoffrey spoke Welsh, and he probably hailed from the French-speaking Norman elite, as he lived roughly a century after the Norman invasion. Geoffrey certainly knew Latin, since his works are all written in the language. While he may not have spoken Welsh himself, he was certainly well aware of the Welsh legends surrounding Arthur and incorporated them directly into his writings. Geoffrey came along at the perfect time for the transformation of Arthur's image. The Arthurian myths of Wales were staunchly anti-Saxon, but the new elite after the invasion of 1066 was not Saxon or even Germanic. William the Conqueror and the Normans had no problem with stories about heroes fighting the Saxons. That said, there was still conflict between the Normans and Welsh, due to the Normans' desire to conquer all of Britain, which is why the abbot of Glastonbury attempted to appropriate Arthur by finding his body near the end of the 12th century. Ultimately, Geoffrey's work was so widely popular and distributed that even Norman kings began to take an interest in the Arthurian legend. What Geoffrey attempted to do was to construct a complete history of Britain, from the time of its purported settlement by Trojan refugees through the invasion of Caesar, the Roman occupation, the withdrawal of the Roman legions, and the Saxon invasion. Geoffrey's work is, like many of its time, a fusion of previous works and his own imagination. Geoffrey had the good fortune, though, of apparently having access to numerous Welsh language texts and possibly oral tradition from the Welsh bards. Hence, unlike other prominent accounts of the time, most notably the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it has an infusion of history from Britain's Celtic peoples, and in its accounts of the Dark Ages, tells the story largely from their perspective. Another work by Geoffrey that has relevance to this account is his Prophetiae Merlini, the Prophecies of Merlin, in which he apparently took the well-known Welsh prophet Meridian Waelid and added him to his account of the life of Arthur. Geoffrey placed an elaborate prophecy into his mouth, and there's no evidence that the prophecy was anything but Geoffrey's creation. Though he discussed many kings and eras, the most influential element of Geoffrey's work, both when it was written and today, is his expansive recounting of the story of King Arthur. Since nobody knows the exact nature or age of the written and or oral Welsh sources that Geoffrey had access to, it's almost impossible to know with certainty how much of his writing consisted of his own fabrications. However, scholars can trace which elements of the Arthurian legend first appeared in Geoffrey's retelling. First, Arthur is explicitly named a high king of Britain and placed in a line of kings between his father, Uther Pendragon, and Constantine. This is perhaps the final step in the centuries-long process of converting the ancient wandering hero into the defender of the nation. Geoffrey further heightened Arthur's importance by introducing Merlin and giving an extensive prophecy that predicts the king's birth and life. Geoffrey also had Merlin performing other miracles, such as the transportation of Stonehenge from Ireland to its current location, and Geoffrey associated Tintagel and Carlion, which became the prototype for Camelot, with Arthur's story, thereby rooting him in the real world. Lastly, Geoffrey converted Arthur from being a defender of the people at Bedon Hill into being a great conqueror who led his armies all the way to Rome and gave territories to his greatest followers along the way. And of course, Arthur is presented as a benevolent ruler who organizes spectacular ceremonies and grants largesse. In addition to refashioning the story, Geoffrey also made the crucial step of retelling his story in Latin. While the Annales Cambriae were written in Latin and mention Arthur, the account is so brief, 2 lines without context or explanation, that it had none of the impact that Geoffrey's text did. Books were much rarer in those days since they had to be transcribed by hand. But Geoffrey's work was so popular that 215 copies survive today. It made an indelible mark on the culture of Norman Britain and began the process of creating the modern Arthur. After Geoffrey's work, perhaps the next most influential piece of the Arthurian legend was the seminal Le Morte d'Arthur, written by the knight prisoner Sir Thomas Mallory in 1469 or 1470, and published by William Caxton, owner of Britain's first printing press, in 1485. The combination of Caxton's ability to distribute the work widely and the inherent beauty of Mallory's writing, which fused many of the popular tales of his time into a single work, has helped to make Le Morte d'Arthur a foundational work. Like Geoffrey's text some 3 centuries before, Mallory changed the nature of the story of Arthur, and all subsequent works on Arthur owe a debt to him. Mallory himself is a controversial figure. At the end of Book 4 is written, "For this was written by a knight prisoner, Thomas Mallory, that God send him good recovery." Nonetheless, there was little consensus about his identity until 1897, when an American named George Lyman Kittredge published a book arguing that Mallory was a knight by the same name from Warwickshire, who was born around 1416 and died in 1470. Little is known about his early life, but as a young man, he apparently found himself drawn into a notorious life of crime. He was imprisoned at Newgate Prison for crimes in 1450, including ambushing the Duke of Buckingham with 26 outlaws, raping a woman named Joan Smith twice extorting the residents of a town named Monk's Kirby, and robbing the husband of Joan Smith. In 1451, after a warrant for his arrest was issued, he is said to have stolen cattle. And then, while the Duke of Buckingham and his men hunted him, he raided the Duke's hunting lodge. The Duke caught up with him and arrested him in 1451, but he escaped imprisonment in the castle he was held in by swimming the moat. He is then said to have gathered 100 followers and raided a monastery at Combe Abbey before he was imprisoned again in 1452. While waiting for trial for 8 years, he was bailed out and allegedly went cattle rustling in East Anglia, which led to an arrest, an escape, and yet another arrest again. Mallory's crimes occurred at an important point in British history. The kingdoms were about to be plunged into a civil war, the War of the Roses, which raged on and off from 1455 to 1485. There were skirmishes before the official start date, and the events of Mallory's life might be seen within that context. In particular, his enemy, the Duke of Buckingham, Humphrey Stafford, was a close ally of the Lancastrians in the conflict to come, and at one point he was captured by the Yorkists after commanding an army against them. By 1451, Stafford was already a prominent figure, and the conflict had already begun to simmer as the Lancastrians had taken control of the Privy Council. By the 1460s, Mallory reappears in history as fighting on the side of the Yorkists in the War of the Roses. He was freed by the Yorkists and aided them in capturing castles in Northumberland. However, he apparently changed sides, though the details are mysterious, and was explicitly excluded from a Yorkist pardon in 1468 and 1470, despite once again being in Newgate, where he was presumably writing Le Morte d'Arthur. When the Yorkist enemies, the Lancastrians, came to power in 1470, he was freed. He died a mere 6 months later. Given the context in which Mallory was writing, and the type of man he was, what role did that play in his writing of Le Morte d'Arthur? And what did he add to the Arthurian legend? The most notable aspect is the generous infusion of Norman sentiment with the concepts of chivalry and the importance placed on knighthood. The modern Arthur is synonymous with chivalry, and this is perhaps Mallory's greatest addition. He appears to desire to use Arthur as a moral template to compare to modern knighthood, and naturally he found his contemporaries seriously lacking. The stories of knights like Gawain, Pellinore, and the other members of the Round Table were used as explanatory tales regarding the concept of chivalry. However, while Mallory put the Round Table front and center, he did not invent the concept. Tournaments long before his time were called Round Tables and were often held in honor of Arthur. It appears that King Edward I, who ruled from 1272 to 1307, was a great Arthur enthusiast and commissioned a great and famous round table at Winchester. The table still exists there today, but it was elaborately repainted at the orders of Henry VIII, with an image of himself put in the place of Arthur. Mallory's work is the first to describe the story of the sword in the stone, and he also expands greatly upon the role of Merlin. The treacherous Morgan Le Fay appears in this story, and the story of Tristan and Isolde is also integrated. Mallory has Lancelot, a French import, eclipsing the native Gawain in his tale, and he develops the complete modern telling with Lancelot loving Guinevere, Lancelot being tricked by Elaine to conceive Galahad, Galahad as a pure Christ figure taking the siege perilous at the Round Table, the Grail quest, Mordred forcing Arthur to punish Guinevere and Lancelot, and the final battle between Arthur and Mordred. Mallory gives life and flesh to the characters in a way that hadn't been done in print before. Arthur is a tragic hero who knows his own destiny and yet strives to live rightly and justly despite it, even after being betrayed by the two he loves most of all. Lancelot is the nobleman who is divided by two loves and punished for it, both by being unable to find the Grail and by exile. Gawain is hot-blooded and vengeful, but loyal to Arthur to the last. And Guinevere lives a double life as a moral compass for the chivalric order, who ultimately betrays that order with her affair. While Geoffrey was able to draw upon the legends of the Welsh in the construction of his narrative of Arthur's life, Mallory had another set of oral folk tales at his disposal, the French troubadours who traveled from court to court in his day. This tradition was brought over from France by the Normans during their invasion of 1066 and was rich in Arthurian tales. These tales elaborated the romantic dimensions and are famous for their stories of impossible courtly love and betrayal. What Mallory did was set the stage for one of the most important shifts in the history of the Arthurian legend. Arthur went from being a symbol of Welsh and Cornish resistance against the English state to the very opposite, as a symbol of Englishness, a legitimizer for the English monarchs, and an ideological reason for the integration of all of Britain, his old kingdom, under English authority. This process was begun by Geoffrey, who made Arthur accessible to the literate classes who read his widespread Latin text. However, Mallory made his work, and thus his whole body of Arthurian legend, accessible to a widespread English-language readership through mass printed publication. The book was very popular, greatly shaping an already nascent presence of Arthur in the English populace. By doing so, Mallory opened the doors for the Tudors. The War of the Roses finally came to an end without either the House of Lancaster or York taking the throne. Instead, a previously minor branch of the Lancastrians came to the throne. Hailing from northern Wales, the Tudors had enjoyed a meteoric rise to power, leading to the coronation of Henry VII as king in 1485. Tudor, like many Welsh nobles, traced his ancestry to Arthur and made Arthurianism state policy. The Welsh Tudor dynasty would be the foretold return of the once and future king, and Henry went so far as to name his oldest son Arthur, though the young man died before taking the throne, leaving it open to his legendary brother Henry VIII. It was during this period that the ruins of Tintagel Castle were reconstructed as an homage to Henry's legendary ancestor. Like in ancient Rome, where Virgil's epic poem The Aeneid appropriated, translated, and transformed Greek mythology in order to convince the Republican citizens of Rome of the legitimacy of their new emperors, Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur translated and repackaged a Welsh myth and was used to convince an English public of the legitimacy of their new Welsh king. Chapter 7. Modern Arthur. With an easily accessible text in English and the official backing of the British state, Arthurianism was able to set down deep roots in early modern Europe. The story of Arthur followed Geoffrey's imagination and conquered Europe. The first place where Arthur gained popularity was in France, where the poet Jean Bodel, 1165 to 1210, described 3 matters that no man should be without. These matters were the great literary cycles of his time. They included Rome, with its classical mythology and the tales of the Caesars; France, with its stories of the Emperor Charlemagne; and Britain, with the stories of Arthur and his knights. Building upon this concept, another Frenchman, Jacques de Longuyon, wrote a text entitled Vœux de Pion in 1312, which laid out the 9 worthies who chivalric men ought to emulate. 3 of them, Hector, Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar, were from the pagan world. Another 3, Joshua, David, and Judas Maccabeus, were Jewish war heroes from the Old Testament. The final 3, Arthur, Charlemagne, and Godfrey of Bouillon, were Christian Europeans. This concept entered pan-European culture, appearing in works like Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost and Cervantes' Don Quixote. In Britain, Arthurianism became the semi-official theme of royal and noble gatherings throughout the Tudor period. For instance, during the reign of Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch, aspiring noblemen would host Arthurian-themed balls, tournaments, and pageants, which included costumes and appropriate decorations to curry favor with the queen. While Arthur was never forgotten, he did fade from importance as the chivalric world that reconstructed him disappeared. In the centuries of exploration, industrialization, and enlightenment, Arthur took a back seat, as did the concepts of chivalry, nobility, and Christian virtue that he represented. The 17th and 18th centuries looked back to the classical era of ancient Greece and Rome for their history, ideals, and icons. However, in the mid-19th century, there was a new surge of interest in medieval times. In literature and art, this movement was known as Romanticism, and in architecture, it heralded the rise of Neo-Gothic. It was especially connected to the ethnic nationalism in places like Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The great emblems of this period included the operas of Wagner, the fairy tale castle of Neuschwanstein in Bavaria, and the great Arthurian poem, The Idylls of the King, by Alfred Lord Tennyson, 1809 to 1892. In the Idylls, Tennyson does not innovate greatly upon the story of Arthur. He drew upon Mallory and the recently translated Welsh tales of the Mabinogion, which were first made available in the English translation by Lady Charlotte Guest between 1838 and 1849. The influence of Romantic nationalism was apparent, as there was an increasing interest in Welsh folk tales amongst the English-speaking public, including many who were Welsh themselves. This made materials available that had not been integrated into Arthurian tales for many centuries. Tennyson's work is an epic poem, published in pieces between 1856 and 1885. Like many Romantic work, The Idylls is a profoundly sad work, where its tragic figures work desperately, but fruitlessly, in a story that all readers already know will end tragically. It is no coincidence that the work is dedicated to the deceased royal consort, Prince Albert, and that Tennyson worked in a royal court full of mourning for the dead prince. At the time of publication, Tennyson was the Poet Laureate of Britain, which, along with his immense popularity, gave his work a semi-official weight. The slow release of the works over decades created a prolonged literary event that influenced poetry, art, and thought of an entire generation. One example of this broader influence and the return of Arthur's popularity were the paintings of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, PRB, in Britain. The PRB was a collection of artists dedicated to reversing the influence of neoclassicism on art and to portray romantic scenes. They often depicted medieval scenes, sometimes with Arthurian themes, such as The Lady of Shalott by John William Waterhouse, 1888, Queen Guinevere's Maying by John Collier, The Four Queens Find Lancelot Sleeping, circa 1926, by Frank Cardigan Cowper, and an elaborate series of murals at Oxford Union depicting the life of Arthur by various artists. This Victorian Arthurianism expressed many of the dreams of social conservatives in Britain, who looked back for an earlier golden age, even if they knew at the time that it never occurred in the way Mallory described. It is this final Arthur that survives today. A legend, replete with women in long flowing gowns, knights polished in armor, a sagacious and mysterious Merlin, love, treachery, gallantry, and sadness. In its lighter form, it makes for great children's stories, and Disney's Sword in the Stone. In its more serious, sad form, it appears in the tragic figure of the Fisher King in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Arthurianism has always looked wistfully back towards a better time. The tellers of Arthurian legends speak about an era when kings and knights lived up to the values that the storyteller sees are missing in his current world. While this is perhaps easier to see in the neo-Gothicism and anti-rationalism of the Victorian poets and artists, it appears as well in the earliest references to the king. In the pre-Galfridian Welsh poem, Ygdydyn, the poet speaks of a brave warrior who, despite his glory on the battlefield, was no Arthur. Even then, in the Dark Ages, the warrior simply could not live up to Arthur's legacy. But in a sense, that's the purpose of the hero. If anyone could match the deeds and morals of Arthur, he would lose his power. Certainly Geoffrey, Mallory, Tennyson, and the venerators of the Nine Worthies knew this too. And there's no question that the mythological qualities of the story draw people to Tintagel and a search for the historical Arthur. Interest in a regional leader like Ambrosius, who died 1,500 years ago, would always be slight, but people still seek to connect the dots because of the legend added on to the actual history. This has been King Arthur, the history and folklore of the Arthurian legend. Written by Charles River editors Jesse Harasta and narrated by Sabrina Z. Copyright 2012 by Charles River Editors. Production copyright 2015